Well, it would be nice to know that the initial plan for these three rather adventurous opera choices worked. Remember the plan of 1961 to present Don Pasquale, Bluebeard's Castle and The Soldier's Tale, but it didn't. The Scottish Arts Council refused funding on the technical ground that the application had come too late for their annual budget, which, however, was not fully spent. A rethink was needed. More work on funding had to be done with a view to trying again in 1962. And there were new ideas for repertoire. A standard work, Madame Butterfly, which was the very first opera Gibson, then aged 12, had seen, and very adventurously, as it turned out very cleverly, Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande. Now this was an astute choice, though it was also a dangerous one. 1962 was Debussy's centenary year. Not only that, but Mary Garden, who was the very first Mélisande in 1904, was still alive and living in Aberdeen, and perhaps she could be persuaded to come down to see the opera, adding piquancy to the occasion. Dangerous though it was, because it was really, it's not the easiest opera on our first hearing, and it certainly wasn't known in Scotland. As for finance, STV offered £1,000, a number of private individuals put their hands in their pockets, and a new approach was made to the Arts Council, this time on rather splendid headed notepaper with the names of various luminaries at the top, headed by Lord Harwood, and this time it worked. The plan was sensibly limited. These two operas would be presented only in the King's Theatre in Glasgow in the nature of a pilot scheme. If it worked, performances would be spread to Edinburgh and eventually other Scottish cities with short opera seasons. It was a try-and-see-it plan. The little team of clever people around Gibson devised ingenious ploys to publicise the whole thing. One of my favourite ones was they persuaded a lot of eager students who liked the idea of opera to go and queue outside the King's Theatre overnight. Now these students in fact all had complimentary tickets. They didn't need tickets, but it appeared that they were so keen to see this that they were prepared to spend the whole night making sure they got in. And the newspapers were contacted, and many of them came along and photographed the students, and so there were pictures in the Scottish newspapers of this. And so in June 1962, Madame Butterfly opened at the King's with a fine cast, including some internationally famous singers, for example, the vastly experienced Elaine Malbon from New York. From the start, Gibson and his colleagues taught the very best singers they could find and afford. Well, we don't have any recording of this Madame Butterfly, but in a moment there will be music from Franz Lehar's The Merry Widow. But before we hear that, let me single out as an example one of these outstanding singers who made the early years of the opera such a success. Now I'm going to be mischievous and conceal this tenor's identity just for a moment. However, I will tell you that he was the 15th son of a Yorkshire labourer, and that his parents died when he was 13. He then, 2 or 3 years later, went into the army, where his skill as a singer was very quickly recognised, and he was drafted to the entertainments unit in India, where he sang during the Second World War operatic arias to the troops. When he came back, left the army, he was taken to some extent under the wing of Sir Thomas Beecham, who had heard him. He was given professional training, and this was the beginning of a very, very outstanding career. By the end of his career, he had sung in Chicago, Vienna, Berlin, Naples, Munich, Venice, Salzburg, Lisbon, Turin, Dusseldorf, all over the place, and he was hailed as the most Italianate of British tenors. With Carla Rosa Opera he sang, with the English National Opera, and of course the Scottish Opera, and many, many, many roles. Before I tell you his name, though you may know it already, of course, here he is with Gelida Manina from La Bohème. Well now, that was Charles Craig. I had never heard him until I listened to these extracts from Scottish operas, fairly early productions, and it's a voice that absolutely stops you in your tracks, not just because of the power and beauty of his full voice, but also the delicacy and tenderness, I would say, of the half voice. It's just astonishing. Anyway, enough about that. So he was one of the very special voices, and I'll mention others later. A singer whom everyone who heard him in Glasgow, Edinburgh, or elsewhere must remember with particular pleasure. And we shall hear him again as Gustavus in Un ballo in maschera in the next video. Now, I promised The Merry Widow. The cast in the EMI recording was more domestic than some, but again first rate. Catherine Wilson's the widow, Johnny Blanc, Patricia Hay, David Hillman, Bill McHugh. And here we have the finale of Act 1, which is full of famous tunes.
Serious reflection, Come, Danilo. I choose you.
I beg your pardon, madame, but I do not dance.
Afraid that you won't find right.
Wrong. I play this dance tonight.
You do? What then?
Well, if this dancing queen is mine, then I can use it as my police. If he objects, speak out. What does he mean? This value price for which 100 thanks is surely worth 10,000 francs. It belongs to me, so I'm asking just 10,000 francs for bishops overseas. 10,000 francs. Is this a slang? I'm our first evening, not so bad. 10,000 francs. He must be mad. Back off. I manage it at last. 10,000 francs. And so never sunshine mine in range of mention cash and off I go. They show they can't endure a least expenditure. They're none in dim with food or belief, old man's a godlike breed. But I can prove that he is lying. His 10,000 francs will soon be paid.
I'm so in love.
But you said yourself.
You don't know such thing.
I pass this job with a ring spool and a knee alone. Now I will dance with you. I was your choice in life you can.
You're too clever, my heart. I know
To take this train, flowers and peace. How can you resist? I do what I can.
Well, you have it all there. An excellent chorus, very fine principals, and very good orchestral playing as well. That must have been a joyful production to watch. You notice it's in English. Sometimes Scottish Opera did sing in English, very often not. They decided opera by opera which was appropriate, and there is a practical thing here too. If you're hiring in principals who know the roles and they sing them in whichever language, the original language, it's very difficult for them to switch to English instead. However, that's by the way. But practical things are very important if you're forming an opera company and putting on operas. Anyway, in our next video we'll move on to another opera, Un ballo in maschera, and we'll also hear of an important and really critical new addition to the little group of people who ran the whole enterprise.